The photograph was still on the mantel. That's the thing I kept coming back to. Later, not the texts, not the receipts, not the specific Tuesday in February when everything finally cracked open. What I kept coming back to was the photograph. The one from Brennan's 40th birthday, for years ago, the three of us at a brewery on Marymount Avenue. Nora laughing at something just off frame, Brennan's arm around my shoulder, my face open and completely unguarded. I had looked at that photograph probably 300 times over 4 years and never once seen what was actually in it. I teach history. Specifically, I teach 12th grade American history at a public high school in Asheville, North Carolina, and the central lesson I return to every semester, the one I consider the most honest thing I can offer 17-year-olds, is that the past does not change, but our understanding of it does. New evidence, new context, new questions. The events stay fixed, but the meaning shifts. I have said this in some form to perhaps 2,000 students over 15 years. I did not understand it personally until I was 43 years old, standing in my own living room in January, holding a phone that didn't belong to me. My name is Joel. Was, at the time this story properly begins, a man whose life had the particular ordered quality of someone who had made deliberate choices and trusted them completely. 12 years of marriage to a woman I genuinely loved. 2 daughters who were, in the way daughters are, the clearest evidence I had that I'd done at least some things correctly. A job I found meaningful, a house with good light on the west side, and a best friend I had known since a shared dorm wall in 1999. Brennan. We'd roomed adjacently freshman year at UNC Asheville, bonded over bad dining hall coffee and an inexplicable shared taste in film. He was loud where I was quiet, instinctive where I was deliberate, the kind of man who filled a room not through performance, but through a natural gravitational warmth that people moved toward without quite deciding to. He'd been at our wedding. He'd held Lily the day she was born. He'd sat in our kitchen through my mother's illness and his own divorce, and everything in between. He was at our house most Sunday afternoons. He knew exactly when I left for work. The first indication, the first one I can identify now, retroactively, with the particular clarity of a man who has since run the timeline exhaustively, was not dramatic. It never is. It was a Sunday in early October, 3 months before everything collapsed. Brennan had come over, as he usually did, arriving around 2 in the afternoon while I was grading papers at the kitchen table. Nora was working in her studio, the converted sunroom where she ran her design business, and the girls were somewhere in the backyard with a project involving chalk and an ambitious mural plan. Brennan poured himself coffee without asking, which he'd done 10,000 times, and sat across from me. We talked about the school year, about a film he'd seen, about the city council vote on the River Arts District development. Normal conversation. Easy. But at one point Nora appeared in the doorway between the studio and the kitchen, just briefly, to refill her water glass, and something passed between her and Brennan that I registered and immediately filed as nothing. Not a look exactly, more like the absence of one. The way 2 people don't look at each other when looking at each other would mean something. I wrote another comment on a student's paper. What would it have taken, at that moment, to pull the thread? One question, one redirected glance. But the mind protects itself with extraordinary efficiency. It categorizes, dismisses, moves on. I had 12 years of evidence that Nora was trustworthy and 23 years of evidence that Brennan was loyal, and one ambiguous non-glance was not going to overturn that architecture. So I didn't pull the thread. And the October light fell through the kitchen window the way it always did, and Brennan drank his coffee, and Nora went back to her studio, and Lily came inside with chalk dust on both knees asking whether marigolds could survive a North Carolina winter. I told her probably not. I was wrong about that too. A marriage at 12 years has its own climate. Not the volatile weather of early love, not those sudden storms and rapid clearings, but something more like the steady atmosphere of a place you have lived long enough to stop noticing. The temperature is known. The prevailing winds are familiar. You don't marvel at the sky anymore. You just live under it. Nora and I had built something genuinely good. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story that turns her into a villain from the beginning would be false, and I am committed to the truth even when it's inconvenient. She was warm, creative, occasionally maddening in her ability to redesign a room in her head 3 times before committing to any of it. She was a devoted mother in the specific way of a woman who had not expected how completely children would reorganize her inner life. She loved Lily and Cora with a totality that was sometimes hard to look at directly, the fierceness of it, the clarity. She and I had grown, over 12 years, into the kind of couple who communicated well about logistics and less well about everything underneath. We had stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, but by degrees, having the conversations that required vulnerability. I attributed this to the accumulation of life. 2 kids, her business growing, my department adding responsibilities. The ordinary sediment of a shared adulthood. I see it differently now. The first concrete sign I noticed and actually registered, not filed away unconsciously, but consciously noted and then deliberately misread, was Nora's phone in November. She had always been someone who left her phone on the kitchen counter or the coffee table, face up, unlocked, the way people are when they have nothing to protect. In November, that changed. Not dramatically. She didn't become paranoid or visibly guarded, but she began keeping it face down. She began carrying it with her between rooms. Once, when I picked it up by accident thinking it was mine, they were the same model, different cases. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took it from my hand with a lightness that was almost casual. "Mixed up again," she said, smiling. "Sorry." I handed it over. "They really do look the same." She went back to the couch, but her thumb had moved to the screen before she sat down, and the gesture had the quality of a reflex, automatic, pre-decided. I told myself she was probably planning Christmas presents. This was November 12th. I remember because it was the night of Lily's school concert, the one where Lily played 3 chords on a recorder with the focused intensity of someone defusing a device. And we had laughed in the car afterward until Cora asked why recorders were so sad, which made us laugh harder. A good evening. A real one. The phone sat between that evening and the ones that came before it like a small cold object I decided not to pick up. Brennan came for dinner on a Thursday in late November. This was less usual. His Sunday visits were habitual, but weeknight dinners happened maybe 4 or 5 times a year. He'd called that afternoon and said he was in the neighborhood and hungry, and I'd said, of course, come over, there was enough pasta. Which was true. He was different that evening. I noticed it and named it to myself as tired. He'd been working long hours at his architectural firm, a commercial project in Weaverville that was apparently eating his schedule. He was quieter than usual, which on Brennan registered almost as absence. He played with Cora after dinner, doing the elaborate card trick she'd been demanding he teach her for 2 months, and he was patient and gentle with it in a way that was entirely his, a quality I had always admired in him. After the girls were in bed, the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table with wine, and I remember thinking, this is good. This specific thing, the 3 of us at this table, is one of the things I'd preserve if I could. Nora poured the second glass. Brennan watched her do it. I watched him watch her. It lasted half a second. Less. His expression was composed, neutral, the expression of a man sitting comfortably at a friend's table. And then he looked at me and said something about the Weaverville project, and the conversation moved on. But I had seen his eyes in that half second, and what I had seen was not the neutral warmth of a longtime family friend watching a friend's wife pour wine. I drank my glass. I said something about a student who had written the most inadvertently philosophical essay about the Korean War. We all laughed. I did not sleep well that night. I attributed it to the coffee I'd had too late. December arrived with the particular compressed quality of a month that demands performance. The school calendar accelerating toward break, the girls' anticipation filling the house like a pressurized system, Nora juggling 2 client projects, and the domestic logistics of Christmas with her characteristic organized intensity. She was distant in December. Not cold. Not in any way that Lily or Cora would have felt. But there was a quality to her presence that was slightly withheld, as if she were managing some internal weather that required her to stay a degree below the surface. She was kind to me. She was present at dinner, interested in the girls' days, engaged when I talked about school. But the kind of touch that had always been available between us, the casual, unthought contact of people who belonged to the same physical space, was marginally less frequent. I chalked it up to stress. Her biggest client, a woman named Renata who was renovating a Victorian in the Montford neighborhood, had been making exacting demands. The holiday project load was genuinely intense. Nora was tired, and tired people withdraw, and I knew this about her. She kissed me goodbye every morning. That much stayed constant. Every morning, at the door, before I drove to school, she would hold my face for just a second, her hands on my jaw, the gesture that had been hers since the beginning, warm and unhurried. Every single morning in December, I drove away thinking about my lesson plans. Someone else was counting the minutes until the car was gone from the street. January begins differently in the mountains. Not with the theatrical cold of northern winters, but with a particular settled grayness. The sky low and textured, the ridgelines visible only in the early afternoon. The city somehow quieter under the weight of cloud. I have always liked January in Asheville. The stripping away of the holiday noise left something cleaner, if slightly spare. This January arrived like all the others, and I moved through its first 2 weeks on the ordinary momentum of a new semester. New students, updated syllabi, the particular energy of a classroom where the relationships were still being established. I was, by professional consensus, a good teacher. Not flashy, not performative, but the kind who understood that history is not dates and documents, but a record of human decisions and their cascading consequences. My students felt that. They stayed after class. At home, something had shifted, subtle enough that naming it felt like accusation, but present enough that I noticed the specific texture of its presence. Nora and I had less to say to each other. Not nothing. We still talked about the girls, about her work, about the renovations we'd been planning for the back porch since the previous spring. But the silence between the talking was different. Where it had once been companionable, the silence of two people comfortable enough not to fill space, it now had edges. She would sometimes pause mid-sentence, as if deciding against the next word. I would sometimes look up from a book and find her looking at nothing, her face doing something interior that closed when she realized I was watching. "You okay?" I asked, on a Tuesday evening in the second week of January. She looked at me. Something processed behind her eyes, quick and invisible. "Fine. Just the Renata project." "Is she still impossible?" "Professionally impossible." A small smile. "Nothing I can't handle." I believed her. I also did not believe her. Both things were simultaneously true, which is, I have come to understand, the specific cognitive condition of a person who is beginning to know something they haven't yet admitted to themselves. The Wednesday that cracked the first small fracture was January 15th. I had a department meeting that ran late, budgetary argument about curriculum resources, the specific variety of institutional tedium that my department head managed to make last 45 minutes past schedule. I arrived home at 6:15 instead of my usual 5:30, which I had texted Nora about at 4. She confirmed she'd seen it. When I came in, she was on the phone. She was standing near the studio doorway, back half-turned, speaking in a low, uncarried voice that she shifted into a higher, more casual register the instant she heard the door. "Okay, I'll look at the samples tomorrow." "Yeah, okay, bye." She turned, smiled. The meeting ran late. Budget meeting. Henderson talked us into a corner. I set my bag down. "Who was that?" "Renata." She moved to the kitchen. "She wants to change the kitchen fixtures." Again, the girls were at the table doing homework. Cora had a worksheet on fractions she was approaching with deep suspicion. The evening assembled itself around us the way evenings do, and I poured water and helped with fractions and asked about Lily's history project, and by 7 the call felt like nothing. But I had heard the shift in Nora's voice. The transition from the low, private register to the public one. It was a fraction of a second. It was a specific, identifiable vocal adjustment. And it was not the voice she used with Renata, whose calls I had overheard a dozen times, which carried a certain professional tension, a slight elevation of careful patience. This voice, before the adjustment, had been relaxed. Warm. The voice of someone in a conversation they were not performing. I helped Cora with 3 more fractions and said nothing. I began watching Brennan. Not with the raw suspicion that would come later, not yet, but with the careful attention of a man who has identified a variable and wants more data before drawing conclusions. His Sunday visits continued through January. He was normal, loud, funny, physically present in the way of a big man at ease in a familiar space. He wrestled with Cora, debated Lily on the relative merits of various hiking trails, fixed the hinge on the back door that I had been meaning to fix since October. But I watched the moments between the moments. The way he and Nora organized themselves in a room. People who are connected, really connected, in the way that changes behavior. unconsciously calibrate their distance. They either maintain it with the rigid deliberateness of people managing something, or they close it in ways they don't notice. Brennan and Nora did the former. They were never physically close in any obvious way. They rarely directed conversation specifically at each other. What they did, instead, was maintain an exact and consistent buffer, a spatial awareness of each other's location that was slightly too precise for two people who had known each other for 12 years. I had spent 15 years teaching students to read primary sources, to notice not just what was said, but what was omitted, what the silence in the document meant, what the gap between stated intention and recorded action revealed. I was, professionally, trained to read exactly this kind of structured absence. I noticed. I did not want to be noticing. I kept noticing anyway. The second thing I noticed about Brennan was his phone. He had come over on a Sunday in the third week of January and left his jacket over the back of the kitchen chair, which he always did. Lily needed help with a school project on North Carolina geography, and Brennan, who had grown up in the western part of the state and knew every peak and watershed, was the obvious resource. He went with her to the dining room table, leaving his jacket and his phone. The phone lit up. I was at the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to see the screen. It was simply visible from where I stood, face up on the chair's seat, and the notification banner appeared and then disappeared before I could read it fully. But I caught two things: the absence of a name, just a number, stored without a contact label, and the first visible fragment of the message before the banner faded. "Can't tonight, he's." That was all. The screen dimmed. I stood at the counter for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. From the dining room, I could hear Brennan explaining the Blue Ridge Parkway to Lily with his characteristic patient specificity. He, present tense. An explanation. An incomplete sentence that required no completion because the person receiving it already knew what came after. I opened the refrigerator. I looked at it without taking anything out. I closed it again. Here is what I knew, by the end of January, beyond the reach of self-persuasion. Nora was keeping something. Her phone had become private. Her emotional temperature had a new weather pattern, and she had, on at least one occasion, been speaking to someone in the low, warm voice of a person absorbed in a private world. Brennan was keeping something. The spatial awareness, the maintained buffer, the phone notification with its unfinished sentence, and its anonymous number, and its pronoun that pointed in only one direction. What I did not yet know was whether those two somethings were the same something. The possibility that they were. The possibility that the person Nora was speaking to in that low, warm voice was the same person who had looked at her across my kitchen table while I talked about my students. The same person who had held my daughters. The same person who had been my closest friend for 23 years. That possibility lived in my chest like a piece of metal. I was careful not to move suddenly. I needed to be certain before I did anything. Not because I doubted my own perception. I had stopped doubting that. But because the specific magnitude of this particular betrayal, if confirmed, required the kind of response that could not be walked back. I had to be exact. I owe that much to myself and to what I'm about to tell you. I did something I am not proud of and would do again. Nora uses a shared family calendar, the digital kind, accessible from any device on our account, primarily for the girls' schedules and her client appointments. She had always kept it current. It was one of the organizational habits that kept the household running. In February, I began reading it with a different kind of attention. The appointments that didn't match her actual movements were not many, but they existed. 3 times in the first 2 weeks of February, her calendar showed client meetings at hours when her car did not leave the driveway. Once it showed a site visit to the Montford renovation at a time when I knew, from a casual mention by Renata's neighbor, a parent of one of my students, that Renata had been out of town that week. I noted each one. The harder thing, the thing that cost more, was checking Brennan's availability against those gaps. This I did indirectly, through the architecture of ordinary friendship. Texts about plans, mentions of his schedule, the natural geography of a relationship that had always been communicative. He canceled our standing February basketball game, citing a project deadline. I checked the timing against one of the unmarked calendar gaps. It aligned. It is a specific kind of grief, the grief of having your suspicion confirmed by someone you love. The confirmation doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the floor of a room you've always trusted becoming briefly transparent beneath your feet. The red herring came from a direction I had not accounted for. In mid-February, Lily came home from school upset. Not her usual managed upset, but the raw, disorganized kind that means something has genuinely landed. After some patient extraction, she told me that her friend Harper had said something about our family. Specifically, Harper had said, with the unconscious cruelty of a 10-year-old relaying adult information, that her mother had told her that our family was having problems. Harper's mother was a woman named Diane. Diane was, incidentally, a client of Nora's from 2 years prior, a woman Nora had described as pleasant but boundary impaired. Diane had no plausible source for information about our marriage, but she had said it, and Lily had heard it, and the question of how Diane knew anything at all landed in my investigation like a splinter in the wrong direction. I spent 3 days turning it over. Had Nora been confiding in Diane? Were there other people who knew? Was the information about problems in our marriage a confession, or rumor, or the distorted echo of something Nora had said in a different context? I went down a corridor of this for 72 hours before I forced myself to stop. Diane was a distraction, possibly an intentional one. If Nora had been strategically managing her social circle, or possibly just the noise of a gossipy woman with secondhand information. Either way, the evidence I had did not point toward Diane. It pointed elsewhere, and I returned to it. The confirmation, final, unambiguous, came from Nora's laptop. This is the part I've turned over most often in terms of my own moral accounting. I do not have a clean story to tell about it. I accessed her laptop while she was at a client meeting, a real one, I confirmed, and Lily and Cora were at school. I sat at her desk in the studio, in the yellow winter light coming through the sunroom windows, and I opened what I needed to open. The message thread was not difficult to find. It was in a communication app they had apparently been using for some time. Not the primary phone messaging system, but a secondary platform, which explained why nothing had appeared on shared bills. I read enough. Not everything. Not because I couldn't bear more, but because the first 3 exchanges contained everything necessary and I did not need to compound the violation. It had been going on for 7 months. 7 months, which placed the beginning in early July. Summer. I had been at a 3-week teacher development program in Raleigh, which I had attended specifically because Nora had encouraged me to, enthusiastically, saying the professional development would be worth the time away. I sat in the yellow studio light for a long time. Then I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood at the window watching a cardinal work through the seeds in our backyard feeder with systematic thoroughness. I thought about my lesson plan for the following Thursday. I thought about the Battle of Antietam and how the Union commander had possessed the Confederate battle plans in advance and still failed to act decisively. And historians had spent 160 years arguing about why. Sometimes a person knows exactly what is in front of them and still cannot make themselves move. I moved. I chose a Sunday. Not arbitrarily. Sundays were Brennan's days, which meant the confrontation, if I was going to have it in a way that was complete, needed to happen when both of them were present. I had thought carefully about this. I could have confronted Nora alone. I could have called Brennan separately. But there was something in me, not cruelty, not theater, that required the truth to be witnessed by everyone it belonged to. 12 years and 23 years, respectively, deserved a reckoning that was actual. I said nothing on the Saturday before. I was present, engaged, genuinely so with Lily and Cora, who were both in the middle of specific preoccupations. Lily's geography project had expanded into something involving handmade topographic maps, and Cora had become committed to teaching herself a card trick Brennan had shown her, with the rigorous daily practice of a 7-year-old who has decided on mastery. I watched Nora that Saturday evening. I watched her tuck Cora in, patient and warm, smoothing the blanket and listening to the particular winding logic of Cora's pre-sleep monologue. I watched her come downstairs and pour a glass of water and sit at the kitchen counter with her design software open, working. She was, in the ordinary surface of the life she had been maintaining, genuinely herself. That was the part that hurt in the deepest register, not the betrayal as an event, but the competence of the performance. Not performance, even. She had simply been living 2 things simultaneously, and one of them was real. Both of them, I think, were real. That is the part no one tells you about. Both lives are real. That's what makes it impossible. Brennan arrived at 2, as always. He had a 6-pack and a good mood and a new story about the Weaverville project that he began telling before he was fully through the door. The girls descended on him with their respective projects. Lily with her topographic map demanding his expert opinion. Cora demanding he verify the correct execution of the card trick. He handled all of it with the ease of a man completely at home. Nora was in the studio. I asked him to sit down. He sat, and something in my stillness reached him immediately, because Brennan had always been perceptive in the way of people who trust their instincts, and his good mood adjusted in a fraction of a second into something watchful. "Joel." "I know," I said. 2 words. The same economy I had used with the evidence. Nothing extra, nothing performative. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the table. His shoulders shifted. Not a collapse. Exactly. More like a release of something he had been holding for a very long time. "For how long have you known?" "Long enough." I called Nora in from the studio. She came to the kitchen doorway and registered the room in under a second. Brennan's stillness, mine, the specific quality of the air between us. And her face did the thing faces do when a reality they have been managing from a distance suddenly arrives at close range. "Sit down," I said. She sat. We were quiet for a moment. The card Cora had been practicing lay on the kitchen counter. Outside, a car went slowly up the street. 7 months, I said, not as an accusation. As a fact, the way I would state a historical date. Neither of them said anything. "I need you both to understand that I've accounted for this," I said. "I know what I know. I don't need the narrative. I don't need the explanation of how it started or what it meant or who feels what now." I looked at Brennan. "What I need is for you to understand that you have to leave and that you are not coming back." He started to speak. "I'm not finished." My voice was level. I had practiced this levelness for 2 weeks. "You were my closest friend. What you did with that is something I'll think about for a long time. But I'm not going to do this with you in my kitchen while my daughters are in the next room. So, you're going to leave." He left. He stood, and he looked at Nora with something I didn't try to read, and he walked to the door, and he left. The house was very quiet for a moment after the door closed. Nora was crying, silently, with the stillness of someone who has stopped expecting comfort. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know. It wasn't. I didn't stop loving you. I need you to know that." I looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," I said. "I also can't hold that. Both things are true." She pressed her hands to her face. "I'm going to take the girls to your sister's tomorrow," I said. "I need a week in this house. Then we'll figure out what the next step looks like for Lily and Cora. Everything else we'll do through Ruth." "Who's Ruth?" "My attorney." The card on the counter. The afternoon light going amber. 12 years in the specific quality of the silence between us. "Joel." Her voice was barely above a breath. I stood up. I went to the living room. I took the photograph from the mantel, the brewery photo, the 3 of us, the one I had looked at 300 times, and I held it for a moment. Then I laid it face down. Not because I was angry, because some things need to stop being looked at before you can see clearly. Here is the twist I didn't see coming. And I say this as a man who had, by the time it arrived, believed himself beyond surprise. 3 weeks after the confrontation, a mutual friend, a woman named Carla who had known Brennan longer than I had, called me. She spoke carefully, with the precision of someone delivering information they have been weighing for weeks. She told me that Brennan had, in December, confessed to her that he was in love with Nora and had told Nora he wanted her to leave me. She told me that Nora had refused. That Nora had, in the weeks before I confronted them, been trying to end it, and that Brennan had made it difficult, that the calls Nora had been making in that low, warm voice had not all been the voice of a woman absorbed in desire, but sometimes the voice of a woman trying to close something that had gotten larger than she'd intended. I sat with the phone in my hand after Carla hung up, and I thought about the message fragment I'd seen on Brennan's phone. "Can't tonight, he's." Not the schedule of a meeting. The logistics of an exit. I don't tell you this to exonerate Nora. 7 months is 7 months, and the harm is real regardless of what she was feeling by December. But it reframed everything in the way that history always does when new evidence surfaces. The events stayed fixed, the meaning shifted. Brennan had been in love with my wife since before the affair began. I went back further in my mind. How far did that go? The October Sunday when they hadn't looked at each other. Earlier. The birthday photograph on the mantel, 4 years ago, the brewery, his arm around my shoulder. Had it been there then? Some version of it? I will never know the precise origin. I stopped needing to. The divorce was not easy. It was not ugly, either. We owed each other that much. and we managed it with the exhausted civility of two people who had once genuinely loved each other and still, in the specific way of shared parenthood, always would. Ruth was thorough and fair. Nora's attorney was professional. We sold the house in April, and I rented an apartment in the River Arts District, in a converted warehouse with high ceilings and windows that faced east. Lily and Cora moved between us with the adaptability of children who do not yet understand that what they are doing is extraordinary. Lily was quiet for a while, in the way of a 10-year-old processing something she doesn't have full language for yet. Cora mastered the card trick and performed it at both houses with equal enthusiasm, which was, I think, her way of insisting that the world remained continuous. I taught the spring semester on something close to autopilot, and then, slowly, came back to it. The classroom was the first place I felt entirely like myself again. Not the version of me that was managing grief, but the one that had existed before any of this, the one who genuinely loved the work. I came back to the Antietam lesson in May and taught it with more honesty than I ever had. About the man who had all the information and still couldn't act. About the cost of hesitation. About what it means to know something and choose, at the critical moment, not to believe it. My students that day were unusually quiet. Brennan texted once, in March. He said he was sorry. He said that he had made the worst mistake of his life, and he knew there was nothing to be done about it. I read the text twice, put the phone down, and did not respond. Not out of cruelty. There simply wasn't a response that served any purpose I could identify. I heard through Carla that he had stayed in Asheville, which I accepted as his right. The city is not small enough to make encounters inevitable, and I did not arrange any. Whatever thread there had been between us had been cut cleanly, and I did not hold the frayed in hoping it would reattach. Some things cannot be rebuilt. That is not a tragedy. It is just a fact, like a load capacity. You don't build above it. The east-facing windows in my River Arts apartment let in a specific morning light in late spring that I had come to value unreasonably. Something about the quality of it, direct, clear, without the filtered softness of the mountain landscape, made the mornings feel deliberate. I drank coffee in it. I graded papers in it. I sat in it and let it do whatever light does to a person who has been in the dark for a while. No one kissed me goodbye in those mornings. I was alone in the particular way that is not loneliness, but solitude, a distinction I had not previously needed to make. I thought about the photograph often. The brewery, the three of us, the moment of evident happiness. I don't think the happiness was false. I think happiness and deception can coexist in the same room, the same frame, the same 4 years of Sunday afternoons, and not cancel each other out. I think that is one of the hardest things to hold, that the good things were also real. I hold it. Lily called me one evening in June to tell me that the marigolds she'd planted in May had survived. She was surprised. She'd remembered that I'd told her they probably wouldn't make it through the spring. I was wrong, I said. I know, she said. But it's okay. They're really pretty. I stayed on the phone with her for 20 minutes talking about soil and light conditions and the specific resilience of plants that are not supposed to make it. I drove to Nora's house the following Saturday and saw them myself, small, orange, unreasonably alive in the corner of the yard, doing exactly what they were not expected to do. You build your calculations on the best available data. Then sometimes the thing you ruled out turns out to be the thing that grows. What makes Joel's story land with such precision is that the betrayal didn't come from a stranger or a vague rival. It came from the architecture of his own life. Brennan wasn't someone who appeared at the edge of the marriage and pulled at a loose thread. He was load-bearing. He was woven into the structure from the beginning, which is why the collapse, when it came, affected not just the marriage but the entire shape of what Joel had believed about himself and the people closest to him. There were red flags visible in retrospect with painful clarity. The non-glance in the kitchen doorway in October, that precise, engineered absence of eye contact between two people managing a secret, was a moment Joel registered and immediately filed under nothing, protected by 12 years of marital trust and 23 years of friendship. The phone notification on Brennan's jacket chair, "Can't tonight, he's," was a complete sentence with one word missing, and Joel's brain supplied the missing word correctly and then declined to act on it. And Nora's vocal shift on the phone in January, that half-second transition from the low, warm register of private intimacy to the calibrated ease of a woman performing normalcy for her husband, that was not ambiguous. It was a specific, identifiable behavior that Joel had the training to recognize and chose, not out of stupidity, but out of the deep human preference for the world to remain intact. The first turning point was the message fragment on Brennan's phone. Before that moment, Joel was operating on gathered impressions, real, accumulating, but individually deniable. The fragment removed deniability from Brennan specifically. It gave the variable a name. And once Brennan was named as a variable, the pattern that had seemed like separate data points resolved into a single shape with terrible clarity. The second turning point, Carla's call after the confrontation, was an entirely different kind of shift. It didn't change what had happened. It changed what it meant. Nora refusing Brennan's demand, trying to end it in December, making those calls in the low, warm voice of a woman not in pursuit but in retreat. This complicates the simple narrative of betrayal into something more recognizably human and far harder to process. Joel was not, as he had believed for 7 months, the last person to know. He may have been, in a specific sense, the only person Nora was trying to protect. Neither exonerates the deception. But understanding that she was trying to close the door by the time he found it open gives the grief a different shape. Less the shape of being discarded, and more the shape of arriving at the scene of something that had already, partially, been burning itself out. The lesson that lives inside this story, the one that doesn't announce itself but accumulates, is about the specific cost of relational comfort becoming relational assumption. Joel and Nora had built something genuinely good, and the goodness had become so established that it required no maintenance. Not because they were careless, but because the human tendency is to stop asking questions about rooms we think we know. The same mind that protected Joel from seeing the evidence early on, the mind that converted each anomaly into a plausible, innocent explanation, is also the mind that had stopped being genuinely curious about the interior life of the woman he came home to every evening. Presence without curiosity is its own kind of absence. And absence, when it persists, creates space. What this story ultimately reveals is that betrayal at this scale is almost never a single event. It is the final visible consequence of a long chain of smaller, quieter choices. Choices to not say something, to not ask something, to let comfort harden into distance and call the result stability. Nora did not wake up one day and decide to betray her marriage. She woke up, over many days, feeling unseen in a particular way that she had no language for, and she made the worst possible response to that feeling. Brennan did not set out to destroy a 23-year friendship. He allowed something that should have been refused to grow until it had its own momentum. What's striking, from a psychological distance, is how each person in this triangle was operating inside their own private narrative. Joel's narrative of a stable marriage requiring no close attention, Nora's narrative of invisible need being finally seen, Brennan's narrative of a love that justified its own cost. 3 separate stories running simultaneously in the same house, on the same Sunday afternoons, under the same roof. None of them fully true. None of them entirely false. The trust that was broken here was not just marital. It was the trust of a man in his own ability to read the world. Joel rebuilt that trust slowly, in classrooms and east-facing light and phone calls about marigolds. That rebuilding, quiet, unsentimental, genuinely hard, is what the story is ultimately about. What I keep thinking about is the photograph Joel laid face down. Not thrown away, not destroyed, just turned over. That feels true to something. The idea that you don't erase the real happiness that existed, you just stop looking at it for a while. The painful part isn't that the good memories were fake. The painful part is that they weren't. And somehow that's harder to carry than a clean lie would have been. How do you grieve something that was genuinely good? You put it face down. You let time do what time does. And eventually, maybe, you learn to hold it without needing it to be something it can no longer be.